Under the red Tennessee moon, the air itself remembers sin. A stranger walks into a town that's already cursed, where bloodlines rot beneath the soil and the living speak in whispers of the dead. But when the past claws its way up through the earth, truth and guilt become one. Everyone thinks they know what haunts Red Hollow. Until the mountain answers back. The wind carried a sound that wasn't quite wind. A hollow moan that rose from the holler and wound itself through the chestnut trees. The townsfolk said it was only the mountain shifting with the weather, but that lie had grown thin over the years. Under the blood-red moon, even the stones seemed to breathe. Red Hollow sat quiet, a single stretch of road, one church, and a row of homes that leaned into the valley as though trying to hide from what watched them above. The mountain loomed larger here than anywhere else. It wasn't distance that made it imposing, but memory, the kind of memory that didn't belong to any one person but to the soil itself. They said Blood Mountain earned its name one autumn night when the sky turned scarlet and a woman disappeared into its caves, leaving behind a trail of blood that no rain could wash away. She was the first to speak the curse aloud, and the last to be seen alive. The older ones still remembered her name whispered over the graves. Mara Wren, the Mountain Woman. A woman wronged by her kin, betrayed in ways that polite tongues no longer described. They said she had married her own brother to preserve the family line, that she had birthed something not quite human, that when the town turned against her, she cursed them all beneath the moon. Most said it was superstition, but they never spoke her name after dark. The mountain was patient. It listened. That year, the autumn came early, brittle and dry. The soil cracked, the river thinned, and the nights lengthened unnaturally fast. The red moon rose before its time, spilling its light over the valley like a wound. It was then that the whispers began again, faint at first, then sharper. The preacher's wife said she heard someone singing in the forest, a woman's voice carrying through the fog. The sheriff found one of his dogs dead by the well, its eyes open, its mouth full of dirt. The townspeople started locking their doors earlier, speaking less, watching the mountain through their windows. Even the children grew quiet. They could feel the air thickening, the silence pressing against their ribs. It wasn't just fear of what might come. It was the sense that something had already begun, and they had all missed the first moment of it. On the seventh night of the blood moon, the bell at St. Jude's tolled 3 times on its own. No one went to see who pulled the rope. The preacher said it was a warning, but the old midwife, Elspeth Crane, just nodded. "She's waking," she said. "The mountain remembers her blood." And in that stillness, as the mist rolled down the slopes and settled over Red Hollow, the mountain exhaled, a low, tremoring sigh that carried through every home, every dream, every hidden fear. Somewhere deep within the stone, the curse stirred again, waiting for the bloodline that had never truly ended. He came at dawn, when the mist still clung to the holler like breath on glass. A man on horseback, his coat worn thin from travel, the brim of his hat pulled low against the cold. No one in Red Hollow had seen him before, but the moment he stepped off the dirt road and into the square, something in the air shifted. It was the name he carried, Wren. The same name that had been scratched off headstones and whispered over dying fires for near 50 years. He said little when he arrived. He rented a room at Elspeth Crane's boarding house, paid in silver that looked older than the town itself, and spoke with the careful courtesy of a man who knew his presence was already unwelcome. He said he was looking for a deed, a small stretch of land at the foot of Blood Mountain that once belonged to his kin. His voice was calm, measured, but beneath it ran the low hum of purpose. The kind that made people glance at their doors before they shut them. The men at the general store watched him from behind barrels of feed. The preacher crossed the street to avoid him, mumbling scripture under his breath. The children, too young to understand, threw stones into the mud where his boots had left prints as if to erase them, but the stranger didn't flinch. He walked the road each day with that same deliberate pace, eyes tracing the ridges above as if listening to something the mountain was trying to say. At night, the wind shifted again. Doors creaked, floorboards groaned, and voices carried through the fog in tones that didn't belong to the living. Some said the river near the old Wren property began to run darker, though none dared go close enough to see. The old fears, the ones people had buried under church hymns and years of denial, began to crawl back to life. Elspeth watched him from the porch one evening, her pipe smoke curling in the amber light. "You shouldn't have come here," she said finally. "That land's no longer yours. It's hers." He turned his gaze toward the mountain where the tree line thickened into blackness. "Then I'll ask her myself," he said. There was something unsettling about his calm. Not arrogance, but inevitability. The way he moved through the town, he seemed neither guest nor intruder, but something in between, like a ghost retracing its own path. The townspeople began to gather at night, whispering about the curse. They remembered how the first Wren woman, Mara, had been betrayed by her blood, how she had died cursing both her kin and the land that cast her out. They said no Wren had returned since, until now. When the red moon rose again, the stranger rode up the trail toward the mountain. The town watched, from their porches, the light flickering across their faces like a warning. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, and then fell silent as if the mountain had swallowed the sound whole. By morning, the fog was thicker. His horse returned alone, its flanks streaked with mud, its eyes rolling with fear. Elspeth stood at her door, listening to the wind breathe through the valley. She didn't ask where he'd gone, she only whispered, "The mountains claimed him too." And yet that night, a candle burned in the window of the old Wren house, one that hadn't seen light in half a century. The townsfolk saw it flicker through the trees, steady and unwavering. Some said it was him. Others said it was her. Either way, the mountain had begun to remember again, and Red Hollow knew that what had been buried was never truly gone. By the second week of the red moon, the town could no longer keep quiet. The stranger's arrival had stirred something that had long slept beneath the soil, and now the stories began to seep out again, in murmurs, in prayers, in the restless dreams that spread from house to house like a fever. The children whispered first. They said they saw a woman's shadow near the well at dusk, her hands folded, her head bowed as if in prayer. The older folk hushed them, but the stories multiplied, echoing through kitchens and over fences, passed from mouth to mouth with trembling fascination. Everyone knew the name they dared not speak aloud. Mara Wren, the mountain woman. No one could say which parts were true anymore. The tales had changed shape over the decades, worn down by guilt and retold through the veil of shame. But they all began with betrayal. Mara, they said, was the last of the old Wren blood, a woman both feared and pitied, who had married her own brother in secret to preserve the family's claim to the mountain. It was a union whispered about, condemned, yet never proven. When her brother vanished, the town claimed God's justice had struck them both. But Mara had not died. She had gone to the mountain instead. Some said she built a fire so high it touched the stars. Others said she carved her family's names into the stone with her own blood. And when the red moon rose that autumn night, she performed a ritual, something older than scripture, older than the church itself. She spoke the words, Elspeth Crane said to the women gathered outside the chapel. Her voice was low, dry as dust. Bound them to the earth. Said no one guilty of her blood would leave this valley untouched. You can bury sin, but the soil keeps count. The preacher had tried to silence her, but even he could not calm the bell that tolled that evening without a hand upon its rope. The sound was uneven, too slow, too heavy, like a dying heartbeat echoing across the ridge. By morning, the town was uneasy. Doors stayed locked, and the sound of prayer replaced the sound of song. Some claimed they heard footsteps outside their windows at night, though no prints were ever found. Others awoke to find the air thick with the scent of iron, as if blood had been burned into the wind. In the tavern, the men spoke of what they called the woman's madness, though none dared to say it too loudly. They blamed her curse for the sickness that had once taken their crops, for the stillborn calves, for every misfortune that had befallen Red Hollow since. But when the stranger's name, Wren, reached their ears, the old fury flickered to life again. It was no longer just a story. It was a reckoning. That night, the preacher stood at his pulpit, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. His sermon turned desperate. Not a plea for salvation, but for forgetting. "There is no curse," he shouted, voice cracking under the toll of the bell that rang once more, though no one had touched it. "There is only sin, and sin must be confessed." But outside the church the wind rose, a low rhythmic sound like the chant of a voice long dead, carried through the pines. The bell began again, faster this time, wild and uneven. The congregation froze. Some fell to their knees. The preacher's wife swore later that she saw a woman in white standing on the ridge, her hair unbound, her face turned toward the church. The moon hung red above her, swollen and bleeding light across the valley. The people of Red Hollow never spoke of that night again. But every autumn since, when the moon bleeds over Blood Mountain, the bell tolls once. Slow, distant hollow, and the air tastes of iron. It is then that they remember Mara Wren, the mountain woman, and the curse that never left the soil. By the second week of the red moon, the town could no longer keep quiet. The stranger's name had loosened something that had been buried too long. People began to speak again of the mountain woman, Mara Wren, though never above a whisper. At first it was small things. Someone claimed to have seen her shape in the fog that crawled down from Blood Mountain. Another said they'd found a circle of dead birds by the riverbank, their bodies neatly arranged like an offering. Every telling grew darker. The story had lived so long that no one remembered where the truth ended and fear began. Some said Mara had been a healer once, a woman who knew the old remedies, the roots and leaves that could calm a fever or stop a heart. Others called her a witch who defied the preacher, who took her own brother to bed under the guise of saving her bloodline. Whatever she was, it ended the same: betrayal. He turned against her when the townsfolk came. They found her on the ridge, her hands and dress soaked red, her voice hoarse from screaming curses into the wind. She had begged them to leave her be, but they dragged her back down to Red Hollow. She was made to stand in the square as the church bell tolled, each clang an accusation. When it stopped, she swore her curse, said that the mountain itself had taken her blood, that those who wronged her would never leave its shadow. Then she vanished. Some said she walked into the caves. Some said the earth opened to take her. Either way, the next morning the river ran red for 3 days straight. Now the bell tolled again. It happened just after sundown, the sound echoing over the roofs, slow and uneven, though no hand pulled its rope. The sound carried into every home, pressing against the walls, humming in the bones of the living. Old Elspeth Crane stood in her doorway, eyes fixed on the mountain. "She's counting," she muttered. "The bell rings for the guilty." The people of Red Hollow pretended not to hear her. They closed their shutters, whispered prayers, and pretended the air did not taste faintly of iron. But by morning they were all thinking the same thing. The curse was stirring again. At the church, the preacher spoke of repentance. "Sin festers where silence grows," he warned, but his voice trembled. He too had dreamed of the woman standing in the fog, her face pale, her hair tangled like wet rope, her eyes open and watching. By nightfall, no one walked the roads. The stranger's horse was seen near the old Wren property, its breath white in the cold air, waiting. Above it, the mountain's silhouette seemed sharper, alive somehow. The moon bled through the clouds, turning the fields and trees a dull, wet crimson. When the bell tolled again, it sounded like it came from beneath the ground. And for a moment, all of Red Hollow stopped breathing, because somewhere deep inside the mountain, something had answered back. The fog never lifted that week. It clung to the town like damp cloth, thick enough to muffle the sound of boots on the dirt road, dense enough to swallow the steeple's shadow whole. Inside that suffocating quiet, the elders met in secret. They gathered in the basement of St. Jude's, where the candlelight pooled low against the stone walls and the smell of mildew mixed with the faint tang of old iron. No one spoke above a whisper, and even then their voices trembled. There were 7 of them, the oldest men and women of Red Hollow, the ones who remembered what their parents had sworn never to repeat. They spoke of balance, of cleansing, of appeasement. The curse, they said, was stirring again. The blood moon had risen too early, the river had turned dark again, and the Wren name had returned. The pattern was repeating itself. "We did what we had to last time," muttered Sheriff Dole, his hands shaking as he poured a measure of whiskey into a cracked cup. "She brought this on herself, you know that." Elspeth Crane, now frail and near blind, lifted her head. "You call it justice," she said, her voice little more than a rasp. "But it was blood for blood, and blood don't wash clean, Dole. It just dries and waits to be spilled again." They turned to the preacher, who stood in the corner, pale and sweating. "We can't undo what's done," he said, "but we can seal it, the same way our fathers did. The ritual binds it to the mountain. It's the only way to keep her spirit from rising." They brought out the book, the one that had been buried beneath the chapel floorboards. Its cover was cracked, its pages yellow and stiff. The writing was not English, not entirely. It was older, borrowed from tongues the church itself had condemned. They drew the symbol in chalk, the same one carved into the stones up by the ridge, a circle within a circle broken once through the middle. And as the elders prepared for the blood moon's arrival, the stranger watched them from the shadows. He had come to the church not for prayer but for answers, his curiosity having curdled into unease. The talk of curses and rituals no longer sounded like superstition. It sounded like memory. He followed the whispers, the footprints in the mud, until the truth began to reveal itself piece by piece. The Wrens were not victims. They were the cause. His great-grandfather. The brother Mara had loved and cursed in equal measure, had been among the men who condemned her. He had offered her up to the mountain to protect the rest, believing her death would save the town. The ritual they performed that night, the one the elders planned to repeat, had been built on a lie. It wasn't meant to cleanse. It was meant to bury guilt. When the stranger read the words on the yellowed page, the truth struck him cold. The sacrifice demanded a blood relative of the betrayer. It was his line the curse had been waiting for. His blood that had to pay. He left the church before dawn, the fog closing behind him. As he walked toward the ridge, he could hear the low murmur of prayer rising from the chapel, the voices of the elders pleading for salvation they did not deserve. The mountain loomed ahead, silent and watching, its face streaked with red light from the rising moon. He stopped where the ground began to tilt upward. Beneath his boots, the soil felt warm, alive. He could smell the iron, the decay, the memory of something long dead. "I came to claim my land," he said quietly, "but it's my blood that owns it." The mountain gave no answer, only the slow sound of shifting stone, deep and deliberate, like something breathing beneath the earth. By the time the moon reached its height, the elders had lit their candles and begun to chant. But far above them, the stranger stood alone on the ridge, the symbol carved at his feet glowing faintly in the red light. He understood now. There was no cleansing, no redemption, only the returning. And as the first drop of his blood fell into the soil, the mountain stirred as if in recognition. The curse had come full circle. The land was remembering again. The night of the blood moon came heavy and strange. Clouds bruised the sky, thick and low, pressing the air flat against the earth. Thunder crawled over the ridge, slow and distant, as though something vast and ancient were stirring beneath the soil. The people of Red Hollow gathered at the foot of Blood Mountain, their lanterns flickering like a procession of ghosts. The elders stood in a circle, faces pale and eyes hollow, each holding a fragment of the past they had sworn never to remember. The stranger was among them now, not by invitation but by inevitability. His face was unreadable, but in his stillness there was a quiet understanding, as though he had finally accepted what the mountain had always demanded of his blood. The preacher stood beside him, hands trembling as he opened the book that smelled of mildew and earth. The pages fluttered in the wind, heavy with words no living tongue had spoken in half a century. They began to chant. It was a low, rhythmic hum at first, a prayer, or the ghost of one. Then it grew louder, shifting into something older, rawer, the syllables snapping like branches underfoot. The mountain seemed to absorb the sound, its echo returning warped and hollow. The flames of the lanterns bent toward the soil, and the shadows of the chanting crowd stretched unnaturally long, twisting up the trees. Sheriff Dole brought forth the blade, a rusted thing that had been wrapped in cloth since the last blood moon. He laid it upon the altar stone, the same slab where Mara Wren's body was said to have been bound before she vanished into the mountain. The stone was still marked with dark veins, thin and branching like old scars. The preacher's voice shook. For the cleansing of Red Hollow, for the ending of the curse, for the blood that binds. He looked to the stranger. The man did not resist. He stepped forward, unbuttoning his coat, eyes fixed on the stone as if he could see her there. The woman whose curse had shaped his lineage, whose blood now pulsed in his own veins. He placed his hand on the surface, feeling it hum faintly under his skin. It was warm, too warm. Then the ground shuddered. A deep groan rippled through the valley, and the air thickened with the scent of rain and iron. The torches flickered wildly, some went out entirely. The chanting faltered. Something was wrong. The thunder didn't come from the sky anymore. It came from beneath their feet. A vibration steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat too large to belong to anything human. The mountain was breathing, resisting. Elspeth Crane fell to her knees, clutching her rosary. "You fools," she gasped. "You've called her, not banished her." The preacher tried to finish the incantation, but the words broke in his throat. The wind rose, cold and sharp, tearing through the trees. Leaves spiraled into the air, and with them came a sound. A voice that was not a voice at all, carried in the thunder. It was low, guttural, and filled with sorrow that burned hotter than rage. The blade on the altar rattled, then lifted just an inch, as if pulled by unseen hands. The stranger backed away, his eyes wide, his pulse quickening. The symbol etched into the ground beneath the altar began to glow faintly red, its light seeping through the cracks in the stone. "Stop," he shouted. "It's not the curse, it's her." But the others couldn't hear him. Their chanting had turned frantic, their fear binding them tighter to the ritual they no longer understood. The air hissed, the fog turned crimson, the mountain's groan deepened into a roar, and then the stone split. A blinding flash tore through the clearing. The earth buckled. Some were thrown to the ground, others vanished into the mist. The thunder reached its peak, not the sound of storm, but of something ancient breaking free. When silence finally fell, the ritual circle was empty. The altar lay in ruins, the blade gone. Only one figure remained, the stranger kneeling amid the ash and fog, his hands still bleeding from where the stone had cut him. The mountain stood unchanged, but its silence was different now, fuller, watching, alive. Above, the blood moon bled its last light across the peaks, and for the briefest moment, the shadow of a woman appeared on the ridge, hair unbound, face turned to the wind, eyes open toward the valley below. The stranger whispered, "It was never her curse." The thunder answered once more, not from the sky, but from within the mountain, a sound like laughter, or grief, or both. The first scream came from somewhere near the ridge, sharp and brief, swallowed almost instantly by the thunder that followed. The earth trembled underfoot, a deep, grinding moan that seemed to come from within the mountain's ribs. The lanterns swung wildly, their flames stretching sideways as though pulled by unseen hands. Then came the wind, hot and metallic, carrying the smell of iron, smoke, and something older, something that had waited too long to breathe. The ritual had splintered into chaos. The elders shouted over one another, their chants dissolving into panic as the chalk lines drawn around the altar cracked apart. The symbols they had carved into the stone pulsed with a dull red glow, veins of light snaking through the soil like blood finding its way home. The fog thickened, no longer gray, but a deep, bruised crimson, swallowing faces whole. Someone cried out, "He's the one, it's him!" All eyes turned toward the stranger. He stood motionless amid the shifting light, his coat torn, his face streaked with ash. The blade, the same rusted knife once laid upon the altar, now gleamed faintly in his hand, though he did not seem aware he was holding it. The preacher stumbled backward, his voice trembling. "The curse wears flesh again. The blood has come to claim us." That was all it took. Panic broke like a fever. Men lunged at shadows, swinging shovels and lanterns. Women dragged their children toward the tree line, screaming prayers that vanished into the roar of the mountain. The fog coiled tighter, and through it came strange echoes, cries that were not human, layered voices whispering from beneath the earth. The trees bowed inward, their branches cracking as if the forest itself were trying to flee. The stranger tried to speak, but his words drowned in the chaos. He moved through the frenzied crowd, hands raised, pleading for calm. Yet each step only deepened their terror. Someone struck him across the shoulder, another threw a stone, then another. The blows came faster, the air filling with the wet sounds of desperation. "Elspeth, stop them!" he shouted, voice breaking. But the old woman was on her knees, eyes fixed on the mountain, whispering, "She's here. She's waking again." Lightning split the sky, casting the clearing in a white glare. For one frozen instant they all saw it, the ridge above them moving, shifting, as though something enormous and breathing lay beneath the rock. The mountain's groan deepened into a hollow, rumbling sound that rolled through the valley, bending the air. The fog surged forward in a violent wave, tearing through the ritual circle, extinguishing every light in an instant. Then came the silence. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then the ground cracked open beneath them. The altar stone split cleanly in two, and from the fissure rose a column of black mist, twisting upward like smoke from a pyre. The people screamed and scattered. Some ran toward the woods, only to vanish into the crimson haze. Others fell where they stood, clutching their ears as the sound of whispering filled the night. 1,000 voices murmuring in a language no one living understood. The preacher stumbled toward the stranger, wild-eyed. "You brought her back!" he shrieked. "You've doomed us all!" The stranger's voice was low, steady even through the terror. "No, you did, when you killed her." The preacher's face twisted with fear and rage. He raised his hands to strike, but the mountain's roar drowned everything. The ground heaved and the fissure widened, swallowing the altar whole. A red glow burst from within the crack, painting every face in light that was not fire but blood. One by one, the townspeople turned on each other. Blinded, screaming, striking at anything that moved. Lantern glass shattered, pitch burned, and the scent of smoke mingled with the iron tang of blood. The ritual had become a massacre. By the time the storm broke, Red Hollow was unrecognizable. The ground steamed where rain struck it, and the fog lay thick over the valley like the lid of a coffin. Bodies littered the clearing, and some clutching rosaries, others still reaching toward the mountain as if begging it to stop. And in the midst of it all, the stranger knelt beside the broken altar, his breath shallow, his clothes soaked through with mud and blood. He pressed his palm to the earth, feeling the faint pulse that still trembled beneath the soil. The mountain was quiet now, but not still. It was listening, alive, awake. He whispered, "It wasn't her vengeance, it was ours." Somewhere above, the ridge shuddered again. For a moment, through the thinning fog, he saw the faint silhouette of a woman standing in the red light, her hair rising with the wind, her eyes fixed on him. Not in anger, but in sorrow. Then she was gone, and the rain fell harder, washing the blood into the mountain's roots. Morning crept into Red Hollow like a trespasser. The storm had passed, but the air remained heavy, soaked through with the smell of ash, rain, and something metallic that clung to the tongue. Mist clung low to the ground, moving sluggishly over what had once been the churchyard, now a field of broken lanterns and mud. No one sang, no one prayed. The bells that had tolled on their own for half a century hung crooked, mute, as if the mountain had finally silenced even them. The town stood hollow. Doors swung open in the wind. Curtains fluttered from shattered windows. In the square, the preacher's Bible lay face down in a puddle, its pages rippling like a creature trying to breathe. The altar stone had been split clean through, half buried beneath the earth. And there in the churned mud near the ridge, only one set of footprints led away from the ruin, heading upward toward the mountain. They stopped halfway up the slope, then disappeared entirely as though the earth had swallowed them whole. The stranger was gone. Those who survived, the few who could still speak, said they saw him vanish in the red fog, walking into the light that pulsed from the ground. Some swore he became the light itself. Others whispered he had taken her place, bound to the mountain in her stead. The preacher's wife, pale and trembling, told anyone who would listen that she heard him say, "It's done," before the thunder took him. When the sun broke through, the light was strange, pale and colorless, as though filtered through smoke. The mountain glistened under it, the dew catching the light in long, uneven streaks. But the streaks ran red. Thin rivers of color seeped down the slopes, vanishing into the valley, staining the river below. Some said it was runoff from the clay. Others couldn't bring themselves to speak. The silence stretched on for days. By the week's end, Red Hollow began to empty. Families packed what they could and left before dusk, unwilling to see the moon rise again. Those who stayed did so out of stubbornness or guilt, too afraid to leave, too proud to admit what they'd done. The graves filled quickly that month, though not all were marked. Years passed. The church collapsed. The fields went fallow. Moss swallowed the stones, and the forest crept closer, wrapping its roots around the bones of the town. The mountain, always patient, grew quiet again, its breath slower, its heart deeper. But silence in Red Hollow was never peace. It was waiting. By the turn of the next century, Red Hollow had become a ghost story told in the mining camps and mountain towns. The name Wren was a curse word, the mountain a place mothers warned their children against. Yet on certain nights, When the moon bled over the ridge and the fog rolled down in thick waves, people said they could still hear it. Faint chanting, the toll of a bell that no longer existed, and a single voice calling out from the trees. Some claimed to see a figure moving through the woods, a man in an old coat, his face hidden, his gait slow and steady. Others swore it was a woman, her hair long, her hands reaching for the soil. But no one stayed long enough to find out. The forest grew thicker each year, reclaiming what belonged to it, and the paths leading up to Blood Mountain disappeared altogether. Now, generations later, Red Hollow lives only in the margins of forgotten histories, a caution whispered over campfires and under breath. Yet when the moon turns red again, the valley still stirs. The air grows heavy, the river darkens, dogs refuse to howl, and those who listen closely swear they can hear voices rising from the pines, whispers carried on the wind, neither male nor female, both young and old. They say it is the mountain remembering. They say it is the blood calling home. And on those nights, when the earth hums low and the shadows move like something breathing, every living thing in the valley knows the truth. The reckoning never ended. It only sleeps between moons,